Hello, wonderful students. This is Miss Franklin, and I wanted to read with you for a little while from our book in English Language Arts, Shipwrecked at the Bottom of the World. And we're going to be looking at chapter 4, I believe, which is titled The Fist of the Antarctic. Very interesting metaphor, saying that the um, Antarctic has a fist, which humans have, and you don't expect a continent to be referred to as having a fist. But as we read, you'll figure out why. Before we get into the reading, I would love for you to join me in exploring some facts that we may know or may not know, or possibly may or may not remember about Antarctica. So, first of all, I'm going to start over here. You may have heard or remember reading that the lowest temperature on Earth was recorded there. That is also hostile. That's one of your vocabulary words, which means harsh, uninhabitable, and unfriendly. People can't really live there because of the different things that we're going to continue reading here and over here. So it has no time zone. And it does have active volcanoes and lava flows. And it's also the windiest place in the world with what is referred to as katabatic hurricane winds. Also in Antarctica, water vapor can freeze in the air. So if you were to throw a bucket of water out into the cold air, before it would hit the ground, it would freeze. And there are no ants, mosquitoes, or reptiles there. And it's a sheet of ice, yet it's also a desert. And if you look at our other continents, you'll see why Antarctica is the furthest south, and the only way you can go from there is north. You can only go north, whether you're going to one of these continents or one of these. It's always going to be north. And that is why it is the southernmost continent and referred to, the shipwreck in this story is referred to happening at the bottom of the world. So once again, the map kind of helps you to see why it would be referred to as the bottom of the world. There is a map that's showing only Antarctica, and it's divided into east and west, with the east being a much larger size. And it's appropriate that this is a white representation of Antarctica because, once again, it is a sheet of ice. So you can just imagine from reading the book and from learning that this place is a sheet of ice where people can't even really live. It has all of these icebergs, glaciers, growlers, and sometimes everywhere you look, there's a little space, but mostly there's ice. And so it's almost like there is a teeny bit of space between a massive sheet of ice in little spots here and there, just a little space in the water around. And as you can see, there is waterways, but there is mostly this massive sheet of ice. So I'm going to start with The Fist of the Universe, which is on page 17. Please read along with me. If you have your mom, dad, or a sibling, or someone else that can read with you, that's also well. But tracking is just a really good practice. And if you're in class and you are given this recording, you're probably going to be given headphones as well so that you can listen without interrupting anyone else in the classroom. Okay? So, The Fist of the Antarctic, page 17. For the rest of December, Endurance picked her way through the ice. Black Barrel peeled a page from the calendar in the wardroom every morning, counting off the days. Outside, the ocean teemed with life. Humpbacks and killer whales spouted in the distance, and the water was dotted with ice floes on which fat, blinking seals basked in the sun. emperor penguins bowed formally to the ship and the crew as they passed. Adelaide penguins surveyed them from passing icebergs and called, "Clark! Clark!" which was the name of the expedition's biologist. The little black Adelies, with a shocking white ring around their eyes, made a comical sight for the crew as they tobogganed off the icebergs into the water. Flocks of Antarctic petrels and snow petrels accompanied the ship on its journey toward the continent, diving with high, wild screams while the crew threw their garbage overboard into the sea. While white albatrosses escorted Endurance through the ice on their magnificent, motionless wings, Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, serenaded the passing wildlife with his banjo. McNeish remarked that the penguins were particularly attracted to the banjo music. "Aye, they're queer creatures, and I ain't never been surprised to see them clapping their flippers when the doctor finished the tune. When he played good old Scots tunes, that was. They're senseless birds. They liked real music, but I can tell you that if he played anything else, they'd break away and rush off in a panic." Hussey's version of the penguins' taste was somewhat different. They liked Negro spirituals and Irish jigs. A strong favorite of which they never tired was "It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary." But when I turned to playing Scottish music, well, they just fled in horror, making off as fast as their short legs would carry them. The animals on board provided entertainment too. Miss Chippy, who despite his name was actually a tomcat, discovered that he could stroll along the tops of the dog kennels just out of reach of the snapping jaws. The half-wolf sled dogs became frantic with bloodlust whenever the cat ambled by overhead. Also on board were 2 pigs, purchased by McNeish for future pork roast, as well as the rats and mice that stow away on any ship. Mrs. Chippy was too well fed to bother hunting, preferring to torment the dogs and dine on scraps from the galley. A galley is a kitchen inside of a ship. The ship made progress, but slow progress. Shackleton had estimated a rate of travel that would put him on the continent by the end of December, but by Christmas they still hadn't passed the Antarctic Circle. The holiday was celebrated with turtle soup, jugged hare, white bait, a type of fish, mince pies, figs, and plum pudding prepared by the cook, Charles Green. When the crew raised their glasses of stout and rum to Christmas carols and toasted "To our sweethearts and wives," the answer came back, "May they never meet." In the last days of 1940, as the last days of 1914 ran out, Endurance continued to creep southward through the Weddell Sea. The course was never a straight one. Sometimes the ship found a lead of open water to the south and followed that with all speed. Other times, Worsley, the skipper, had to sail the ship west along the edge of the pack, searching for open water to enter, even sailing north from time to time when the pack was impenetrable or standing still, waiting for a lead. Feeling like a rat in a trap, Worsley looked for leads from the crow's nest and signaled the course to the man on the bridge. Ice blink, a white glare of the underside of the clouds, indicated pack ice ahead. A water sky, a dark reflection on the clouds, showed where the open water lay. Okay, go ahead and take about a half minute, kind of take a deep breath before we continue reading on page 18. Okay. Shackleton explained, "Worsley, Wild, and I, with 3 officers, kept 3 watches while we were working through the packs, so that we had 2 officers on deck all the time. The carpenter had rigged a 6-foot wooden semaphore on the bridge to enable the navigating officer to give the seaman or scientist at the wheel the direction and the exact amount of helm required. This device saved time as well as the effort of shouting. Occasionally, when the frigid atmosphere was charged with water, every rope and spar on the ship was frosted white, making Endurance look like another species of sparkling white iceberg as it nosed its way through the pack. When the sun came out, the icicles fell from the shrouds and shattered like glass on the decks below. Sometimes open leads of water in all directions were wreathed with wisps of frost smoke as the water began to freeze, and Shackleton commented that the effect resembled the smoke from a prairie fire. The sun never set, and even when there was fog, it was never dark. Often the crystalline air formed mirages, and the sailors saw icebergs suspended upside down on the horizon. These mirages made navigation around the bergs very dangerous because it was often hard to tell what was a real iceberg and what was a phantom. Knowing the difference was critical, especially since Endurance often passed more than 400 bergs in a 24-hour period. It was a crowded sea. On New Year's Eve, they crossed the Antarctic Circle at last, and some of the men gathered on the bridge to sing Auld Lang Syne, with an accompaniment of dog howls. So the dogs were howling as they sang the song that even now that people sing when a year is ending and a new one is beginning. May old acquaintance be forgot and never. So you may have heard that song, and that's the title, Auld Lang Syne. So anyway, reading on, the ice grew denser and open water became harder and harder to find. There was no sign that the pack was opening up at all. Day and night, ice growled and scraped along the sides of the ship. The men heard it grinding while they slept, while they ate or played cards, while they stoked the engines or read the charts. When fog and ice made progress impossible, Shackleton ordered the ship moored to a large iceberg or floe. That means they stopped and anchored down for a while, not trying to move. Then the men and dogs could take advantage of the wide, flat floes to get some exercise. Hockey and soccer games were the sport of the choice among the men. As for the dogs, they could chase penguins and run wild without going too far. On all sides was the frigid sea, where killer whales cruised in search of a meal. These beasts have a habit of locating a seal by looking over the edge of a floe and then striking through the ice from below in search of a meal. They would not distinguish between a seal and a man, Shackleton noticed. Let's look at the pictures and the captions on these two pages. So on page 20, it says, "To our sweetheart and wives, may they never meet." And we read on the previous page about them making that toast on New Year's Eve or Christmas. And then this one has a caption, which is right next to the paragraph and above the picture that says, "A soccer game on the ice during a hold-up, waiting for a lead to open so the ship could continue." All right, let's go ahead and now we're going to look at the pictures first on page 22 and 23, and we will be finished with this chapter. So we really are almost done. Go ahead, please, and let's read. Let's look at the pictures and the captions on page 22 and then on 23. They're both really interesting. I guess they were adapted from photographs that were taken, which to me must mean that the cameras were pretty decent in 1914 when this event occurred. Then I want you to take just a little stretch break, and we're going to finish that last page. We're going to be done after we read the captions and that last page. And you will, of course, move on to the next chapter. Okay, so as you know, sometimes the lights go out if there's not enough movement, and so that helps to save electricity. But I stood so that I could get the lights back on and you can see me easier. But mostly you should be tracking and reading along with me on page 22 and then 23. The only reading really is the caption. So on 22, you see the big, huge iceberg, and it says in the caption, a huge iceberg observed from the ship, January 16, 1915. So once again, a new year has begun. And then on page 23, the caption with that picture says, the sea is frozen into an impenetrable barrier of crushed floes, January 1915. Okay, we're going to read and finish this out. On one occasion, when Endurance was moored to a floe, the crew hauled out the motor sledge. Ordlays, the motor expert, got the machine going, and Marston pretended it was an ice cream wagon. Several sailors did imitations of Cockney boys begging for a treat, as Marston hammed it up as an ice cream vendor. When the kidding was done, however, the men gave the motor sledge a test run. On the uneven surface of the ice, the machine turned out to be awkward and impractical, and plans to use it were abandoned. As the days went on, Endurance crept forward through leads that closed in behind her. Open water was becoming harder and harder to find, as shifting mass of ice stretched from one horizon to the next. 2.5 weeks into the new year, Hurley wrote in his diary, "It is now 7 weeks since we first entered the ice pack, and since then it has been almost an incessant battle." The weather was not improving and the ice showed no signs of opening. On the next day, January 19th, the fist of the Antarctic closed around the ship. Endurance was surrounded by ice pack with no open water in sight. They had sailed 12,000 miles from London. They had picked their way through 1,000 miles of packed ice. Now they were less than 100 miles from the continent itself. But Endurance never reached it. Okay, we're going to stop. But I want you to just keep a couple of things in mind as we have learned about context clues in Mrs. McInnes's class. And we looked at the ideas chart that where each one of those letters stood for something related to how context clues are given, which was inference for the I. D, definition. Yes, some authors put the definition right there after they use that new word or that unfamiliar word. And then, of course, there is E. They may give you an example. And then A is for an antonym. They may give you something in that sentence or a nearby sentence that means the opposite of the unfamiliar word. So that's antonym. And then the S is for synonym, which is a word that means the same. So those are ways. And when you see these kinds of words that you don't understand or that you don't know, your context clues are going to help you tremendously. So get plenty of practice with using context clues and referring to that ideas chart for examples as you went through in your class. Let's look at this caption for page 23, where it says, "The sea is frozen into an impenetrable barrier of crushed floes." So the word impenetrable is given there, and that is a pretty big word, but it's also used in our reading. And so if you were to look at the words surrounding it, that would help you to figure out what impenetrable actually means. So here are some clues on page 22. All right, if you would with me, please look at the second paragraph on page 22. It says 2.5 weeks into the new year, Hurley wrote into his diary. So he's just making an account of what they're experiencing during this trip. And so he says toward the end of the first quote and the quote is in quotation marks to show exact words that he spoke. It says, "It is now 7 weeks since we first entered the ice pack, and since then it has been almost an incessant battle." So he's referring to a battle. That could be a good clue. The next sentence, it's not an exact quote anymore. It says the weather was not improving. So the fact that the weather was not improving is another clue as to what impenetrable could mean. And then it says the ice showed no signs of opening. That's probably the best clue of all to let you know that impenetrable means not able to get through, they were not able to navigate the ship any further because the ice had no openings in it, no little spaces that they had been finding wide enough for their ship were available any longer. And that is what caused them to actually become basically stranded in their ship Endurance. And it's also why this chapter was called the Fist of the Antarctic. That place where they reached, if you think of a fist, nothing nothing can get in the fist or out. And that's what Endurance was like, because they actually were almost like they were inside of a fist, and there was no possibility of moving to the left or the right, east or the west, north or the south, because the ice was surrounding them with no opening of water in sight. Anyway, that's just one context clue, but the idea is that you should try to use clues in a sentence or around a sentence where a new word is used to figure out what it means or what it might mean. Great evening or day to you. Bye-bye.